How has COVID impacted your life?
As a lawyer, ironically enough, I had started doing the YouTube vlogs about a year before this and had been doing that for a fair bit of time once this all happened. So it didn't affect my practice all that much because I wasn't practicing that much active law. I have a few clients that I kept. So from a professional perspective, I know some lawyers are doing better, others are doing worse. Depends on the type of law that they're practicing. For me, it didn't really have much of an impact. Where it impacted was the growth of the YouTube channel, just because of online viewing had gone up. Everybody's locked down, and they have not much else to do but watch TV, and people started watching the channel. As a parent, let's say as an adult, it didn't change much either for me because married with 3 kids, I'm not exactly going out and partying in any event. So I can appreciate minimal impact on me, but I can appreciate and I see the impact it has on others, in-laws, younger people that I know who are single, want to date, can't date anymore. You can't even kiss people anymore. It's like, so I've seen the way it's impacted other people, even though it hasn't impacted me all that much. For my kids, is a different story. We are pretty well-rounded, pretty well grounded, but it's hard on them. Where Zoom friend meetings and Zoom birthdays are not a substitute for human interaction. And we go out and play outside. No sleepovers. No going to your friends' houses after school. It's not. It will impact them, and our goal as a parent is to make sure that it doesn't traumatize them and impact them negatively going forward. So we have to do our best to sensitize, to discuss, and to get out in as much as possible. But I've seen the way it's impacted other kids, and it has not impacted other kids as well as some kids jump across the street to avoid being too close to somebody. Some kids, are just permanently traumatized from this. Some kids are they're not going to get the developmental interactions they need to develop, say, healthily. And I see it, and it's sort of soul crushing to some extent.
And in terms of, because COVID has impacted us in many different ways, like you said, but is there one particular thing, again, as a lawyer, as a father, just that is a big frustration for you?
People say COVID has impacted us, and where I'm starting to see now, it's COVID has impacted us to a certain extent. It's the COVID measures implemented by the government that are affecting us far beyond what COVID has in fact affected us. Nobody's going to deny the numbers. Nobody can undermine the numbers. 22,000 deaths in Canada since the pandemic started is a very serious thing. Can't lose sight of the fact also that 80% of those fatalities occurred in long-term healthcare facilities. So, it has impacted certain sectors a lot, tremendously. But the measures have impacted other sectors, which could have, in my humble opinion, I'm not a politician, but I might have had different policy. It's impacted other areas, other aspects of life in a way that is going to be devastating, but we're only going to see the devastation in the years to come. I know of people who are not getting their cancer treatments. Elective surgeries are being canceled, and people tend to think elective surgery is like, oh, I'm going to have a cyst removed from my wrist. No, these elective surgeries are things that are going to have impacts on people's health in the long run. So COVID has impacted people's lives in one way, and these measures have impacted lives in another. And the most depressing thing to me is to see what started off as a drip, drip, slow chisel has turned into an absolute free fall to no longer having any value or any respect for core democratic civil right principles on which our society was based. So much so that you have Justin Trudeau quite literally in a speech on the internet saying, some people want to have a conversation about the Constitution. He's not engaging in that. I mean, it's come to, and it's not a political thing. I criticize. It's no less unacceptable when François Legault does it, imposes a curfew, than it is when Justin Trudeau does it. It's not a politics issue. It's a freedom and civil rights issue, and some people have gotten very complacent. Some people are ushering in more of it, and that's what I find to be the most frustrating thing: is people don't appreciate the damage that we have done to a free and democratic society in response to a virus that ought to have been taken seriously from the beginning, arguably wasn't. And what are the consequences? A government that didn't pay enough attention in the beginning is now crushing civil rights and civil liberties a year over later, as its responsible response to what it did or did not do a year ago.
And you touched a bit on the curfew. I know we spoke of it last time that I interviewed you, but I'm curious to see, because we're 2 months into it. It's still going on, and in Montreal and in all red zones. What's your take on that?
It was a year into the pandemic, and I don't expect to ever get a response from François Legault on Twitter, but we had a year to prepare for what they were announcing was going to be the second wave a year ago. The rationale for the lockdown was to flatten the curve to not overwhelm healthcare facilities. A year later, I'm not sure what François Legault has done to augment healthcare, the hospital facilities. I don't know what he did. I'm not sure if he did anything. I do know what he did is spending, what was it, $13 million a month on COVID awareness. What has been done in the year that we had to prepare to increase hospital capacities to deal with a winter surge, which tests the limits of our healthcare system in ordinary flu seasons? What do? I don't know. But a year later, in response to what was done or what was not done, impose a curfew as if that has any correlation to reducing the spread. And when I have trouble with this, it's not to be contrarian. It's not to pretend to be a scientist. When Horacio Arruda, the director of health, I forget his exact title, when he says that there's no concrete evidence to support the effectiveness of a curfew to stop the spread of a virus, how then do you go into implementing such a draconian wartime measure? And a lot of people smarter than me note that all it does is exacerbate the problem. When people can't go grocery shopping during off hours at night, you concentrate everybody in those same areas during the day. And Horacio Arruda, in addition to saying, no concrete evidence, says this really is more of a wartime measure to prevent nighttime riots, things like that. And it's not effective to spread a virus. And not only do they implement it for 4 weeks, they're going into the third month now and don't even bat an eye as to what they're doing. And people feel comfortable and they think that this offers some protection and are therefore complacently accepting it or even willingly ushering it in. And I mean, what can you say about it? In my humble opinion, it's undoubtedly unconstitutional. The only problem is, and we've seen it tested in the courts, when you go in for an emergency relief, there's a presumption of constitutionality of the law, and you have to show radical irreparable harm in order to overturn it. And a lawyer in Gatineau filed suit. The judge said, presumption of validity, and you didn't allege any harm other than the fact that you can't go out of your house after 8 o'clock at night. So that's on one standard of the threshold. On a longer term, I think it's unquestionably unconstitutional. It's a limitation that cannot be justified. It is not a minimal restriction on civil rights to obtain a definitive end, and nor is there any definitive causal relation between the implemented measure, the restriction on civil rights, and the desire to end. So that's my opinion. Some lawyers are filing suit in a longer term battle. The shorter term suits don't seem to be going anywhere. Declared unconstitutional as relates to homeless people. I mean, I guess that's something of a constitutional victory, although it was the fact that we needed the courts to tell our politicians that imposing a curfew on the homeless is unconstitutional and illogical. That goes to show you where our politicians' heads are at.
And speaking of that, can you tell me why governments can do this right now? Because, of course, we're in a health crisis, but why is this possible for them to apply something that they don't have evidence for? They've repeatedly told us that they cannot measure the effectiveness of it. And because it's put in place with multiple other measures, they can't individually examine which one is working and which one isn't. So why can they do this?
So, I mean, the why is a big one. As far as it goes with curfews, I think it's pretty widely accepted that there is no correlation. California had a curfew, cases went up. We've been in curfew, cases are going down, but they went down in Ontario where there was no curfew. So, but I don't want to get into the science of it. The law side, how can they do it? Hey, there's a law called the Emergency Powers Act or whatever, La Loi sur la Santé Publique in Quebec, similar emergency powers in other provinces and states. In theory, my understanding of the law, I may be wrong, but I'm not sure that I am, is that the laws allow you to make emergency measures for certain periods, depending on the jurisdiction, 10 days, you can renew them. But typically after 30 days, any of these ordinances or edicts have to go through the legislative process, which they haven't in Quebec, which they haven't in other provinces, which they haven't in certain states. And so these emergency powers acts, I do live streams with a lawyer once a week, and one thing we often say is, if the emergency lasts a year, it may not fit the emergency criteria for what these laws were designed to do. So some jurisdictions are testing it and overturning it in the States. The decision coming out of The Hague, where they were contesting the curfew on the basis of these emergency powers. There was a lawsuit filed seeking to declare the curfew unconstitutional because it was enacted in virtue of this Emergency Powers Act, which was not intended to give these sweeping measures. The lower court overturned it, said it's the wrong law to impose this curfew, and then the Court of Appeal overturned it. In the meantime, though, the government just rushed through the law anyhow, so they got what they wanted in any event. But how can they do it? I'm not sure that it's constitutional what they are doing, because I believe after a certain period of time, and I believe it's 30 days in Quebec and maybe the same in the rest of Canada, if these measures remain in effect, they have to go through the legislative process and get adopted by the legislature, go through a debate, public debate, so people can see what's going on. And when they're enacted as laws, then you can have your, you can have your say at the voting booth if you want to vote out these people who created laws out of these emergency measures. But as far as I understand, they're questionably constitutional. It just takes time to get to the courts to have them declare that. Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms is challenging it, but it takes time. So court system is a question of hurry up and wait.
And in terms of the other measures, not just the curfew, can you tell me how it's infringed people's civil liberties, basically? Because
the other measures, well, this is the thing. I'm not a free radical anti-government. Some measures will violate your civil rights and liberties, like wearing a seatbelt is the classic one, where it was constitutionally challenged. If I want to not wear a seatbelt, you can't compel me to wear a seatbelt. The test is that you have to look at the severity of the infringement, which core principle is it violating, and then there'll be an elevated level of scrutiny depending on whether or not it's a more fundamental principle, a more fundamental freedom. So wearing a face mask violates some of your rights. The question is the measure restrictive enough that the limitation is going to be justifiable? So when it comes to certain things, social distancing, I don't think any of these have actually become law. So I still think they're ordinances or measures enacted in virtue of these emergency powers, but they all, to some extent, limit certain freedoms. The question is there a causal connection between the objective sought and the restriction? Is the restriction as minimally invasive as it has to be in order to achieve that objective? And with some, you can understand. Face masks, I could always understand. I still think it shouldn't be legally required because that creates a slew of other problems, including distrust. And I think you would have gotten the same level, if not about the same, of participation in the absence of $800 fines for not doing it. But it's invasive, but minimally so. It's restricted in public areas. Where it can get excessive is, if they make you wear a mask outside at all times, and then you get into the same violation, but is it minimally restrictive to achieve an objective? And is there a causal connection between wearing a mask outside when you're all alone in a park versus going shopping? And then what some of the other measures, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what the other measures, shutting down the businesses, shutting down non-essential businesses, non-essential, whatever that means, can't get more fundamental than that. And to say that you have to shut down the businesses as opposed to allowing operation with certain limitations, that's a whole other issue. But these are policy issues that need to be addressed as such. And when it's time to vote, you vote according to whether or not you thought what they did was proper, justifiable, and reasonable, and whether or not the cure was worse than the disease.